A killer's mercy is death. Livia Marchesi had once been royalty, a queen in waiting. But when her father's empire was destroyed, she learned a brutal truth: without power, she was nothing. And now he had found her. Rafael Costa smirked, his fingers brushing over her wrist. "You thought you could disappear?" he murmured. "That was adorable." Chapter 1. The Ghost of a Golden Cage. The chipped porcelain of the teacup warmed Livia's hands, a small comfort in the chill that seemed to have permanently settled in her bones. From the narrow window of her tiny Florentine apartment, she could see the Duomo, its majestic dome a hazy silhouette against the bruised, gray sky. It was a view that, 5 years ago, would have been framed by the gilded edges of a palace window, attended by servants and the hushed reverence that came with being the only daughter of Don Alessandro Marchesi. Now it was just a view, a reminder of how far she had fallen. Livia traced the faded floral pattern on the cup. It was a remnant from her grandmother's collection, one of the few things she'd managed to salvage when the world she knew had imploded. The scent of the Earl Grey tea, a weak imitation of the imported blends she used to favor, did little to soothe the persistent knot of anxiety in her stomach. She hadn't used her real name in years. Olivia March, a carefully constructed alias, was all that remained of Livia Marchesi, heiress to a shattered empire. A sudden, sharp rap at the door sent a jolt of fear through her. It was too insistent, too confident to be the landlady, Signora Rossi, who usually shuffled and wheezed her way up the stairs. Livia set the cup down, the delicate clink echoing in the otherwise silent apartment. She hadn't expected anyone. She never expected anyone. Her life was a carefully curated tapestry of anonymity, woven with threads of routine and obscurity. Work at the small bookstore, quiet evenings, no friends, no connections. A ghost, haunting the edges of a city that had once bowed at her family's feet. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Another rap, this one louder, more demanding. It was accompanied by a voice, low and smooth, that sent a shiver of something other than fear down her spine. "Signorina March? I know you're in there. We have business to discuss." The voice was undeniably male, and held an undercurrent of steel beneath the polite veneer. It wasn't a voice that took no for an answer. Livia's heart hammered against her ribs. How had they found her? She'd been so careful, so meticulous in erasing every trace of her former life. She'd dyed her hair, a dark, unremarkable brown that hid the fiery auburn curls that had once been her signature. She'd adopted a plain, unassuming wardrobe, a far cry from the designer gowns and jewels she'd once worn. She had even altered her speech, shedding the aristocratic lilt for a more common, less noticeable accent. Taking a shaky breath, she forced herself to unlock the door. A sliver of afternoon light pierced the dim hallway, illuminating the figure standing on her doorstep. He was tall, his presence filling the narrow space, and undeniably striking. Not handsome in a conventional way, but compelling. His face was a study in sharp angles and hard lines, dominated by dark, intense eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that screamed of wealth and power, a stark contrast to her threadbare surroundings. A faint scar bisected his left eyebrow, adding a touch of dangerous allure to his already intimidating presence. His dark hair, with just a touch of gray on the temples, was swept back from his forehead, emphasizing the intensity of his gaze. Livia swallowed hard, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. "I think you have the wrong person," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The man smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Livia Marchesi," he said, her real name sounding foreign, almost forbidden, on his tongue. "Or should I say, Olivia March? You've been a difficult woman to find." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, the scent of expensive cologne, and something darker, something wilder, filling the small space. Livia instinctively recoiled, her back pressing against the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about," she insisted, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another shiver down her spine. Don't insult my intelligence, Kara. We both know who you are. And we both know why I'm here. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her wrist. The touch, though fleeting, sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a touch that held both a threat and a promise, a dangerous combination that left her breathless. You thought you could disappear? He murmured, his voice a silken whisper that seemed to wrap around her like a velvet shroud. That was adorable. His dark eyes, filled with an unsettling mixture of amusement and something far more dangerous, held her captive. Livia stared at him, her mind racing. This was Rafael Costa. She knew it instinctively, even though she'd never met him before. The name had been whispered in hushed tones in her father's study, a name associated with power, ruthlessness, and a long-standing rivalry with the Marchesi family. The Costas were old blood, their roots intertwined with the very fabric of the Italian underworld, a force even her father had treated with a grudging respect. But the Marchesis were gone, wiped out. So, why was Rafael Costa here? What do you want? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely audible. Rafael's smile widened, a flash of white teeth against the darkness of his complexion. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. I want what is owed to me, Principessa. And you are going to help me get it. He straightened his posture, his eyes observing every small reaction she tried to conceal. Get inside, Livia. We have much to discuss, and I assure you, I will not ask twice. The authority in his command was impossible to ignore. Her life, her quiet, her false sense of safety had just been irrevocably shattered. The ghost was being forced back into the light, back into a world she had desperately tried to escape. A world of shadows, secrets, and blood. A world where Rafael Costa held all the cards. The hook that will propel. Is this all a dream? Will she wake up? Chapter 2. Whispers of the Fallen Empire. The apartment felt smaller, more suffocating, with Rafael Costa inside it. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his size, his eyes taking in every detail of her meager surroundings. He didn't sit, but rather stood by the window, his back to the fading light, his silhouette a dark, imposing presence against the backdrop of the city. Livia watched him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, feeling like a trapped bird facing a hawk. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "There?" he asked, his gaze flicking to the chipped cup on the small table. It was such an ordinary question, so incongruous with the tension that crackled in the air, that it almost made her want to laugh. A hysterical, disbelieving laugh. Yes, she stammered, gesturing towards a kettle. I can make some more. She needed something to do, something to occupy her hands, to distract her from the tremor that threatened to overwhelm her. He inclined his head, a gesture of polite acceptance that seemed utterly out of place. Please. As Livia busied herself with the familiar ritual of making tea, she tried to gather her scattered thoughts. Rafael Costa's presence here was a nightmare come to life. The Costas and the Marchesis had been rivals for generations, their feud a tangled web of blood oaths, broken alliances, and simmering resentment. It was a rivalry that had existed in the shadows, a silent war fought with whispers and veiled threats, but a war nonetheless. A war her father had lost, spectacularly and catastrophically. She poured the boiling water over the tea bags, the fragrant steam momentarily clouding her vision. Her father, the memory of him, once a towering figure of strength and authority, now reduced to a fleeting, painful image, stabbed at her heart. He had been betrayed, his empire dismantled, his life brutally taken. And she, his beloved daughter, had been left to pick up the shattered pieces. Your father was a formidable man, Raphael said, his voice breaking the silence. He had moved closer, standing just behind her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Livia stiffened, her hands tightening around the teapot. He's dead, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, a shield against the overwhelming grief that still threatened to consume her. Indeed, Raphael agreed, his voice a low murmur. But legacies have a way of lingering, don't they? She turned to face him, handing him a cup of tea. Their fingers brushed, sending another jolt of that strange, unsettling energy through her. I have no legacy, she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a flicker of defiance. I am Olivia March, a bookseller. Nothing more. He took a sip of the tea, his eyes never leaving hers. Such a convincing performance, Kara. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, I see the fire of the Marchesi bloodline. It cannot be extinguished so easily. Why are you here? Livia asked again, her voice trembling slightly. She needed to know, to understand the purpose of this intrusion, this shattering of her carefully constructed peace. Raphael set his cup down on the table, the delicate clink echoing in the silence. He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into hers. Your father, he owed my family a great deal. Not just money, although there was certainly that, but something far more valuable. Something that was stolen from us. Livia frowned, her mind struggling to grasp his words. Stolen? I don't understand. My father was she hesitated, the word honorable sticking in her throat. Even she, his adoring daughter, had begun to question the carefully constructed narrative of his life, the stories of honor and integrity that had been drilled into her since childhood. Raphael chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Honorable? Alessandro Marchesi was a thief and a liar. He built his empire on the bones of my family, on broken promises and spilled blood. Livia shook her head, her mind reeling. That's not true. It is true, Raphael interrupted, his voice hardening. And I intend to reclaim what is rightfully mine. And you, Livia, are going to help me. I don't know anything, she protested, her voice rising in panic. I was just a child. I didn't know about his business dealings. Perhaps, Raphael conceded, his eyes narrowing. But you were his daughter. You lived in his house, breathed the same air, heard the whispers. You know more than you realize. And even if you don't, you are still a Marchesi. Your name, your blood, carries a certain weight. He reached out and touched a strand of her hair, the gesture surprisingly gentle. You remind me of your mother, he said, his voice softening slightly. She had the same fire, the same stubborn pride. Livia pulled away from his touch, a wave of nausea washing over her. Her mother. Another painful memory, a ghost that haunted her dreams. She had died when Livia was young, a victim of the very world she was now being dragged back into. Don't talk about my mother, she said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. Raphael's expression hardened again. I will talk about whatever I please, Principessa. You are in no position to dictate terms. He paused, his eyes searching hers. You have a choice, Livia. You can cooperate with me, help me retrieve what was stolen, and perhaps you can rebuild something from the ashes of your father's empire. Or you can resist and face the consequences. And believe me, the consequences will be severe. He let the threat hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Livia looked at him, her mind racing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and a strange, unexpected flicker of something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The choice she has makes her believe she is in a prison. Chapter 3. The Unseen Hand of Fate. The silence in the small apartment stretched, taut and heavy with unspoken words. Livia felt the weight of Raphael's gaze, the pressure of his expectation, pressing down on her. She was trapped, caught between the ghost of her past and the very real threat of her present. A choice, he had said. But was it really a choice at all? What was stolen? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question felt like a betrayal, a crack in the carefully constructed wall she had built around her heart. To acknowledge the possibility of her father's wrongdoing was to admit the fragility of the world she had once believed in. Raphael's lips curved into a slow, enigmatic smile. Patience, cara. All in good time. For now, it is enough that you understand the stakes. He paused, his eyes searching hers. You will come with me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an order disguised as a request. Livia's mind rebelled. To leave her apartment, her sanctuary, to willingly walk into the lion's den, it was madness. But the alternative, the unspoken threat that hung in the air, was even more terrifying. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To my home," he replied, his voice smooth and unyielding. "Where you will be safe. And where we can begin to unravel the truth." Safe. The word felt like a mockery. How could she possibly be safe in the home of her family's sworn enemy? But as she looked at Raphael, at the intensity in his dark eyes, she saw something that surprised her. A flicker of something that wasn't entirely cold, wasn't entirely ruthless. A hint of something that just might, be genuine. "I need time," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a desperate need to retain some semblance of control. "To pack. To make arrangements." Raphael studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "You have 24 hours, he said finally, his voice clipped and precise. "I will send a car for you tomorrow afternoon. Be ready." He turned to leave, his movements fluid and graceful. At the door, he paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "One more thing, Livia," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Don't even think about running. I will find you, and the consequences will be far worse than anything you can imagine." The door closed behind him with a soft click, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Livia stood there, frozen, her body trembling, her mind reeling. 24 hours. It felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment. She had 24 hours to decide whether to embrace the darkness, or to try, one last time, to escape it. She walked over to the window, her legs feeling heavy and unsteady. The city lights twinkled below, a vast, indifferent expanse. She felt utterly alone, lost in a labyrinth of secrets and lies. But as she looked out at the night sky, a sliver of moon emerging from behind the clouds, she felt a flicker of something else, something deep within her, stir. A spark of defiance, a refusal to be broken. She had survived this long, hadn't she? She had carved out a life for herself, a fragile, precarious existence, but a life nonetheless. She had learned to be strong, to be resourceful, to be invisible. And now, she would have to learn to be something more, something braver, something dangerous. She touched the window pane, the cool glass a stark contrast to the heat that was beginning to build within her. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would face Rafael Costa, and she would uncover the truth, whatever the cost. She owed it to her father, to her mother, to the ghost of the girl she once was. And perhaps, just perhaps, she owed it to herself. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. The air felt thick with anticipation, with the weight of unspoken promises and hidden dangers. The game had begun, and Livia Marchesi, the fallen heiress, was about to become a player. The unseen hand of fate was pushing to surface, a surface that Livia didn't know. Chapter 4. A bargain struck in shadows. The 24 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity and restless indecision. Livia packed a small suitcase, choosing practical, unassuming clothes, the kind that would help her blend into the shadows. She left a note for Signora Rossi, a vague explanation about a family emergency, knowing that the old woman would likely gossip, but hoping it would be enough to buy her some time. She visited the bookstore, her heart heavy with a sense of farewell, and spoke to her employer, a kind, elderly man named Marco, fabricating a similar story. As she walked back to her apartment, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, she felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This was it. There was no turning back. She was stepping into a world she had desperately tried to escape, a world of power, betrayal, and hidden agendas. The car, a sleek, black Mercedes, was waiting for her when she arrived. The driver, a silent, imposing man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, opened the door for her without a word. Livia slid into the plush leather seat, the scent of expensive leather, and something darker, something more primal, filling her senses. The car moved smoothly through the city streets, the familiar landmarks blurring into a hazy, dreamlike sequence. She tried to focus, to prepare herself for what was to come, but her mind was a chaotic jumble of fear and anticipation. Raffaele Costa. The name echoed in her thoughts, a constant reminder of the danger she was facing. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else. A grudging respect, perhaps, for his power, his confidence, his unwavering determination. And something more strange, unsettling attraction that she couldn't deny. The car finally pulled up to a large, imposing villa on the outskirts of Florence. It was surrounded by high walls, topped with wrought iron spikes, and guarded by imposing gates. The villa itself was a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, its stone facade weathered by time, its windows dark and secretive. It was a fortress, a symbol of power and wealth, and a stark reminder of the world Livia had left behind. The driver escorted her through the gates and up a long, winding driveway lined with ancient cypress trees. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a fragrance that evoked a sense of both beauty and melancholy. As they approached the villa, Livia saw him. Raffaele Costa was standing on the steps, waiting for her. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He descended the steps as she approached, his movements fluid and graceful. "Welcome, Livia," he said, his voice a low murmur.
"To my home."
She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't speak, couldn't break the spell of his gaze. He offered her his arm, a gesture that was both courtly and possessive. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his sleeve. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a symbolic crossing of a threshold. He led her into the villa, the heavy wooden door closing behind them with a resounding thud. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior, a vast, echoing space filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and the hushed silence of centuries. It was a museum, a mausoleum, a testament to the enduring power of the Costa family. Raphael led her through a series of ornate rooms, each more opulent than the last, until they reached a large, wood-paneled study. The room was dominated by a massive fireplace, a roaring fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. A large, antique desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with papers and books. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that spoke of generations of knowledge and power. He gestured towards a comfortable armchair near the fireplace. "Sit," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Livia sank into the chair, the soft leather a welcome contrast to the hard, unforgiving reality of her situation. Raphael sat opposite her, his dark eyes studying her intently. "Now," he said, his voice low and resonant, "let us talk about the truth." He leans forward, resting his elbows in his knees. "My grandfather, Eduardo Costa, was a collector, a connoisseur of rare and beautiful things. Not just art or jewels, but secrets, information, things that could be used to influence events." Livia listens with a straight back, ready to listen. One of those secrets was the Marchesi ledger. He named a detailed record of your father's dealings, his alliances, his weaknesses. It was a treasure trove of information, something that could have brought down his entire empire. "And my father stole it," Livia concluded the thought. "Precisely," Raphael confirmed. "He stole it and used it to his advantage. To blackmail, to manipulate, to consolidate his power. He built his empire on the foundation of my family's stolen legacy." Raphael paused. He observed her features for a long time, like he was trying to see through her skin. "I want it back, Livia. And you are going to help me find it." The bargain was struck. How the Marchesi ledger will surface is now up to Livia. Chapter 5. Echoes of Lost Grandeur. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on Raphael's face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the intensity of his gaze. Livia felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. The Marchesi ledger. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of generations of secrets and betrayals. I don't know anything about a ledger, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the truth, or, at least, a part of the truth. She had never seen such a thing, never heard it mentioned in her father's hushed conversations. But she had sensed it, hadn't she? The undercurrent of secrecy, the veiled threats, the constant awareness of unseen enemies. Raphael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, he conceded. But you lived in his house. You were his daughter. You must have seen something, heard something, even if you didn't understand it at the time. Livia closed her eyes, trying to conjure up the memories of her childhood, the fragmented images of her father's study, the hushed voices, the locked drawers. It was like trying to grasp smoke, the memories elusive and intangible. I remember fragments, she said slowly. Whispers. Meetings late at night. Men with hard faces and watchful eyes. She opened her eyes, meeting Raphael's gaze. But I was kept apart, protected. My father, he wanted to shield me from the realities of his world. A convenient excuse, Raphael said, his voice laced with cynicism. But perhaps a useful one. He paused, his eyes narrowing. The ledger, it was more than just a record of his dealings. It was a map. A map to his hidden assets, his secret alliances, his contingency plans. Livia frowned. Contingency plans? For what? For anything, Raphael replied, his voice hardening. Your father was a man who always had a backup plan, a way out. He knew that his empire was built on a precarious foundation, that his enemies were always circling. He prepared for the possibility of collapse. Collapse. The word echoed the reality of her own life, the sudden, catastrophic destruction of everything she had known and loved. Her father had anticipated it, planned for it, and yet, he hadn't been able to prevent it. So, you think the ledger is still out there? She asked, her voice filled with a hesitant hope. I know it is, Raphael said, his voice firm and unwavering. And I believe it is the key to reclaiming what was stolen from my family. And perhaps to rebuilding something from the ashes of yours. Rebuilding. The word resonated with Livia, stirring a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose, of possibility, of a future that wasn't defined solely by loss and regret. But where do we start? She asked, her voice stronger now. If my father hid it so well, Raphael smiled, a slow, enigmatic curve of his lips. We start with you, Kara. With your memories, your instincts, your connections. You are the key, Livia. The key to unlocking the past. He stood up, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked over to a large, antique globe that stood in a corner of the room. He spun it slowly, his fingers tracing the contours of the continents. Your father, he had a passion for history, for art, for the romance of the past, he said, his voice thoughtful. He saw himself as a modern-day Medici, a patron of the arts, a ruler of his own small kingdom. Livia nodded, remembering her father's love of all the old things, all the history. He had a villa, Raphael continued, his fingers stopping on a small island off the coast of Italy. A secluded retreat, where he would go to escape, to think, to plan. He looked at Livia, his eyes searching hers. Do you remember it? Livia's heart skipped a beat. A villa. A forgotten memory, a fleeting image of a sun-drenched island, a whitewashed house overlooking the turquoise sea. She had been there once as a child. A brief, idyllic escape from the pressures of her father's world. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I remember. A faint, almost imperceptible, smile touched his lips. Then that, Kara, is where we shall begin. The villa, and how it will impact is now up to Livia. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Gentle Grasp. The journey to the island was shrouded in secrecy. A private helicopter, its blades slicing through the pre-dawn darkness, carried them away from the mainland, away from prying eyes and watchful enemies. Livia sat beside Raphael, her body tense, her senses on high alert. The rhythmic thrum of the rotors was a constant reminder of the precariousness of her situation, of the dangerous game she was playing. She glanced at Raphael, his profile stark against the faint glow of the instrument panel. He seemed calm, almost serene, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He exuded an aura of power, of control, that was both intimidating and strangely alluring. She couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw her towards him, despite the fear, despite the knowledge that he was her family's sworn enemy. "What is this island called?" Livia asked, her voice breaking the silence. She needed to talk, to distract herself from the unsettling thoughts that churned in her mind. "Isola del Serpente," Raphael replied, his voice a low murmur. "Serpent Island." The name sent a shiver down her spine. It was a fitting name, she thought, for a place shrouded in secrets and hidden dangers. A place where the past slithered and coiled, waiting to strike. "Why Serpent Island?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Raphael smiled, a slow, enigmatic curve of his lips. "Legend says that the island was once home to a mythical serpent, a guardian of hidden treasures, a creature of both beauty and danger." He glanced at her, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "A fitting metaphor, don't you think?" Livia didn't reply. She understood the metaphor, the subtle comparison between the island and herself. She was the guardian of her father's secrets, the keeper of the key to his lost legacy. And she, like the serpent, was both vulnerable and dangerous. As the helicopter began its descent, Livia saw the island emerge from the darkness, a jagged silhouette against the lightning sky. It was small, barely a mile across, dominated by a rocky peak that rose dramatically from the sea. The villa, a whitewashed structure with red-tiled roofs, was nestled on a secluded cove, sheltered from the wind and waves. The helicopter landed on a small, grassy helipad near the villa. The air was fresh and clean, scented with salt and the faint fragrance of wild herbs. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of the waves lapping against the shore and the distant cry of a seagull. Raphael helped her out of the helicopter, his hand firm and steady on her arm. "Welcome to Isola del Serpente," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Your father's sanctuary." Livia looked around, her eyes taking in the beauty of the surroundings. It was a world away from the bustling city, from the suffocating pressure of her former life. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, of escape. But she knew that beneath the serene surface, danger lurked. The serpent was waiting. He led her towards the villa, the gravel path crunching beneath their feet. The villa was smaller than his residence in Florence, but it was no less impressive. It was built in a traditional Mediterranean style, with thick stone walls, arched doorways, and cool, shaded courtyards. The interior was furnished with a mix of antique and modern pieces, a testament to her father's eclectic taste. As they walked through the villa, Livia felt a strange sense of familiarity, a ghostly echo of her childhood memories. She remembered running through these halls, playing hide and seek in the courtyards, listening to her father's stories of the island's mythical past. It was a bittersweet feeling, a mixture of nostalgia and loss. Raphael led her to a large, airy study that overlooked the sea. The room was filled with books, maps, and nautical charts, a testament to her father's love of the sea and his strategic mind. A large, antique desk sat in the center of the room, its surface covered with a layer of dust. This was his favorite room, Raphael said, his voice soft. He would spend hours here, poring over his charts, planning his conquests. Livia walked over to the desk, her fingers tracing the dusty surface. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to connect with her father, to understand the man he had been, the secrets he had kept. "The ledger," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where do you think he would have hidden it?" Raphael joined her at the desk, his eyes scanning the room. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere unexpected." He paused, his gaze settling on a large, ornate fireplace that dominated one wall of the room. "But where?" He stared at the fireplace for long minutes, his eyes moving slowly from detail to detail. "Help me move this," he asked, pointing towards a big old painting that was over the fireplace. "This is our first clue," he assures. The search begins. And the weight lies on the old painting. Chapter 7. Masks of Civility and Deceit. The painting was heavy, its ornate frame digging into Livia's fingers as they struggled to lift it from the wall. Raphael, with his greater strength, took the brunt of the weight, his muscles straining beneath his shirt. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood, a tangible reminder of the passage of time, of the secrets that lay hidden within these walls. As they carefully lowered the painting to the floor, Livia saw it. A small, rectangular safe, embedded in the stone wall behind where the painting had hung. It was old, its metal surface tarnished with age, but it was undeniably there. A hidden repository of her father's secrets. Raphael's eyes gleamed with a mixture of triumph and anticipation. "Well, Kara," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It seems your father was a man of predictable habits." Livia didn't reply. She was too focused on the safe, on the secrets it held within. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm of fear and excitement. This was it, the moment of truth. Raphael knelt before the safe, his fingers examining the dial. "It's an old combination lock," he said. "Probably something simple, something personal to your father." He tried a few combinations, his movements precise and methodical. The numbers clicked softly in the silence, each click echoing the passage of time, the weight of expectation. Livia watched him, her breath held captive in her chest. "Your birthday?" he suggested, glancing at her. Livia shook her head. "No." He wouldn't have used something so obvious. Raphael tried her mother's birthday, the date of their wedding anniversary, other significant dates from their family history. But the safe remained stubbornly locked. Frustration flickered across his face, a brief crack in his usually impassive mask. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind clearly racing. Livia watched him, her own frustration growing. They were so close, and yet so far. "Think, Livia," he said, his voice sharper now. "What was important to your father? What were his passions, his obsessions?" Livia closed her eyes, trying to conjure up the image of her father, the man he had been behind the mask of power and authority. She remembered his love of history, his fascination with the Medici family, his admiration for their cunning and their ruthlessness. "Lorenzo de' Medici," she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. He always admired him. He saw himself as a modern-day Lorenzo. Raphael's eyes narrowed. "Lorenzo the Magnificent," he murmured. "The ruler of Florence, the patron of the arts, the master of deceit." He returned to the safe, his fingers quickly dialing in the numbers. 1429. The year of Lorenzo's birth. There was a click, a soft, satisfying sound that echoed in the silence. The safe door swung open, revealing its contents. Livia's breath caught in her throat. Inside, nestled among a few bundles of old documents, was a leather-bound book. It was smaller than she had expected, but it was undeniably there. The Marchesi ledger. Raphael reached into the safe and carefully removed the ledger. He held it in his hands, his fingers tracing the embossed leather cover. He looked at Livia, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and something else, something that looked almost like gratitude. "You did it, Livia," he said, his voice soft. "You found it." Livia stared at the ledger, her mind reeling. She had done it. She had unlocked the past, uncovered her father's secrets. But what now? What would they find within those pages? And what would it mean for her, for Raphael, for the future? Before he could answer, a sharp, insistent buzzing sound broke the silence, so sudden Livia gasped. Raphael's expression changed, suddenly alert. He got his phone from his pocket. "Costa," he answers, with his eyes still fixed in Livia's. His expression turned to stone after a few seconds of silence, as he listened. "When?" he asked, the only word, and hung up. He looked at Livia, his dark eyes filled with a cold fury that made her blood run cold. "We have a problem," he said, his voice dangerously low. "A very big problem. The external problem." Chapter 8. Beneath the Gilded Surface. Raphael's words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Livia felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The brief moment of triumph, of shared accomplishment, had vanished, replaced by a chilling sense of foreboding. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What's happened?" Raphael's jaw was clenched, his eyes dark with anger. "That was one of my men," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "There's been a breach. At my villa in Florence." Livia's mind raced. A breach? What did that mean? A break-in? An attack? The possibilities were terrifying. "What kind of breach?" she asked, her voice trembling. Who was it?" Raphael hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers. "We don't know yet," he said. "But it seems they were looking for something. Something specific." Livia's heart sank. The ledger. It had to be the ledger. Someone else knew about it. Someone else wanted it. And they were willing to go to extreme lengths to get it. "The ledger," she said, her voice filled with a sickening realization. They were looking for the ledger. Raphael nodded, his expression grim. "It seems so. Someone knows about its existence. Someone close to your father, perhaps." The thought sent a shiver down her spine. A betrayal? From within her father's inner circle? It was a possibility she had never considered, a darkness that threatened to engulf everything she had believed in. But who? She asked, her voice pleading. Who would do this? Raphael's eyes met hers, his gaze intense and unwavering. "That, Kara, is what we need to find out. And quickly." He turned and strode towards the door, his movements swift and purposeful. Livia followed him, her mind racing, her heart pounding. They had to get back to Florence, to protect the ledger, to uncover the identity of the traitor. As they reached the helipad, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the island. The sky was ablaze with color, a fiery spectacle of orange, red, and purple. It was a breathtakingly beautiful sight, but Livia couldn't appreciate it. Her mind was consumed by fear, by the realization that they were caught in a web of deceit and betrayal, a web that was far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The helicopter lifted off, its blades slicing through the evening air. Livia sat beside Raphael, her body tense, her senses on high alert. She glanced at him, his profile stark against the fading light. He seemed calm, almost detached, but she could sense the tension in his body, the coiled energy that was ready to be unleashed. "Who do you think it is?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. Raphael didn't reply for a long moment. He stared out at the darkening sea, his expression unreadable. "I have my suspicions," he said finally, his voice low and cryptic. "But I need proof. I need to understand the motive." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Your father, he had many enemies. But he also had allies. People he trusted. People who benefited from his power." Livia nodded, her mind racing. She thought of the men she had seen in her father's study, the hushed conversations, the veiled threats. She had always assumed they were enemies, rivals. But what if they were something else? What if they were wolves in sheep's clothing, waiting for the opportune moment to strike? "There was Antonio Bellini," she said slowly, remembering a name, a face from her childhood. "He was my father's consigliere, his advisor, his most trusted confidant." Raphael's eyes narrowed. "Bellini," he murmured. "Yes, I know of him. A man of ambition. A man with a reputation for ruthlessness." He paused, his gaze flickering away from hers. "But he was also close to your mother," he said, his voice softer now. "There were rumors." Livia's heart skipped a beat. Rumors? About her mother? About Bellini? The thought was unsettling, disturbing. It opened up a whole new dimension of betrayal, a darkness that she had never suspected. "What kind of rumors?" she asked, her voice trembling. Raphael hesitated. "Rumors of an affair," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A secret liaison, hidden from your father's eyes." The words hit Livia like a physical blow. Her mother. And Bellini. The thought was almost unbearable. It shattered the image she had held of her parents, of their perfect, loving marriage. It cast a shadow of doubt over everything she had believed in. I don't believe it," she said, her voice shaking. "My mother, she would never perhaps," Raphael said, his voice gentle but firm. "But we need to consider all possibilities, Livia. We need to uncover the truth, whatever it may be. The truth, it seems it might destroy the image Livia has." Chapter 9. The Price of Protection. The return to Florence was a blur of tense silence and suppressed anxiety. Livia felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach with every passing mile. The image of her mother, once a beacon of love and stability, was now clouded by suspicion and doubt. The idea of Antonio Bellini, her father's trusted advisor, as a potential betrayer, and even worse, her mother's lover, was almost too much to bear. Raphael, sensing her distress, reached out and took her hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a reassuring presence in the midst of the turmoil. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "We'll find out the truth, Livia," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I promise you." She nodded, clinging to his words, to the strength that radiated from him. She needed him, she realized. She needed his protection, his guidance, his unwavering determination. She was in over her head, caught in a world of shadows and deceit, and he was her only lifeline. The villa, when they arrived, was a scene of controlled chaos. Raphael's men, armed and alert, were everywhere, securing the perimeter, investigating the breach. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence. Raphael led her through the villa, his hand firmly on her arm, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He took her to a secure room, deep within the heart of the villa, a room that was clearly designed for emergencies. It was sparsely furnished, but it was safe, protected. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I need to find out what happened." "I won't be long." Livia nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to protest, to demand to stay with him, but she knew he was right. She would be safer here, out of harm's way. He hesitated at the door, his eyes searching hers. "Don't open the door for anyone," he said, his voice low and serious. "No matter what you hear. Understand?" "I understand," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, then turned and left, the door closing behind him with a heavy, final thud. Livia sank onto the small cot that was the room's only furniture, her body shaking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She felt utterly alone, isolated, trapped in a gilded cage. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds of the villa, the hushed voices, the heavy footsteps, the constant reminder of the danger that surrounded her. She thought of her mother, of the rumors, of the possibility of betrayal. The image was painful, agonizing. It shattered the foundation of her childhood memories, the carefully constructed narrative of her family's history. She opened her eyes, staring at the blank walls of the room. She couldn't stay here, cowering in fear. She needed to do something, to take some control of her own destiny. She needed to find out the truth, whatever it may be. She stood up, her legs feeling shaky but determined. She walked over to the door, listening intently. She could hear nothing but the faint hum of the villa's ventilation system. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Raphael had told her to stay put, to not open the door for anyone. But she couldn't just sit here, waiting, wondering. She needed to be proactive, to take a risk. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She opened the door, a sliver at first, then wider. She peered out into the hallway. It was empty, silent. She stepped out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved slowly, cautiously, down the hallway, her senses on high alert. She had to find Raphael, to find out what was happening, to help in any way she could. She was a Marchese after all, and Marcheses didn't cower in the face of danger. They faced it head-on. As she made her way through the labyrinthine corridors, a glint of metal caught her eye. Partially concealed beneath an antique console table, she spotted a small, intricately carved wooden box. It looked familiar, stirring a distant memory. She felt a powerful intuition she had found something relevant. Her action will lead her. Chapter 10. a dance of danger and desire. Livia knelt beside the console table, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the wooden box. It was undeniably familiar, a faint echo of her childhood, a forgotten memory stirring in the depths of her mind. She remembered seeing it in her father's study years ago, tucked away on a high shelf, out of reach of her curious hands. He had told her it was a gift from her mother, a special keepsake. She carefully lifted the box, her heart pounding in her chest. It was heavier than she expected, its weight suggesting a hidden significance. She tried to open it, but it was locked. A small, delicate keyhole was embedded in the front of the box, a silent challenge. She looked around, her eyes scanning the hallway. She needed a key, something small and slender that might fit the lock. She spotted a silver letter opener lying on the console table, its blade gleaming in the dim light. It was a long shot, but it was worth a try. She carefully inserted the tip of the letter opener into the keyhole, her hands trembling slightly. She jiggled it gently, feeling for the delicate mechanism of the lock. There was a click, a soft, satisfying sound that made her heart leap with hope. She carefully opened the box, her breath held captive in her throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, antique key. It was made of gold, its handle intricately carved with the Marchesi family crest, a rearing stallion, a symbol of power and defiance. Livia stared at the key, her mind racing. What did it unlock? Where did it belong? She had a sudden, overwhelming intuition that it was important, that it held a clue to the mystery that surrounded her. She closed the box, clutching the key in her hand. She had to find Raphael, to show him what she had found. She stood up, her legs feeling stronger now, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. As she turned to leave, she heard a sound. A soft footstep, a rustle of fabric, coming from the end of the hallway. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Someone was there. She quickly ducked behind the console table, concealing herself in the shadows. She peered through the carved legs of the table, her eyes scanning the hallway. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, imposing man with a hard face and watchful eyes. It was Antonio Bellini. Livia's breath caught in her throat. Bellini, her father's consigliere. The man who might have been her mother's lover. The man who might be behind the attack on Raphael's villa. He was walking slowly, cautiously, down the hallway, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He was holding something in his hand, a small, dark object that glinted in the dim light. A gun. Livia's blood ran cold. Bellini was armed, and he was clearly looking for something or someone. He stopped in front of the room where Raphael had left her, his hand reaching for the doorknob. Livia knew she had to do something, to stop him, to warn Raphael. But what? She was unarmed, outnumbered, outmatched. As Bellini reached for the door, a figure tackled his, both falling into the floor. Raphael. Livia, go! He shouted as he wrestled with Bellini. The sound of a gunshot. It pierced the air. Livia ran. Her heart will lead her. But to where? Chapter 11. Scars of the past, wounds of the present. Livia ran. Blindly, instinctively, driven by a primal fear that clawed at her throat. The gunshot echoed in her ears, a terrifying reminder of the violence that was unfolding just steps away. She didn't know if Raphael was alive or dead, if Bellini had been subdued, or if he was still a threat. All she knew was that she had to escape, to find safety, to somehow make sense of the chaos that had engulfed her life. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the villa, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, her shadow flickering in the dim light. She had no destination in mind, no plan, only a desperate need to get away. She found herself in a part of the villa she didn't recognize, a wing that seemed older, more neglected than the rest. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, a tangible reminder of the passage of time, of the secrets that lay hidden within these walls. She stumbled upon a large, ornate door, its surface covered in intricate carvings. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her inside. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it a refuge or a trap? She pushed the door open, cautiously, and stepped inside. It was a library, a vast, cavernous room filled with towering bookshelves that reached to the ceiling. The air was cool and still, scented with a musty aroma of old books and leather. Moonlight streamed through a large, arched window, illuminating the room with an ethereal glow. Livia felt a sense of calm wash over her, a momentary respite from the terror that had gripped her. The library was a sanctuary, a place of knowledge and contemplation, a world away from the violence and betrayal that had consumed her life. She leaned against the door and tried to get some air. She needed to think, but her mind refused. It was only replaying the gunshot. She focused in the key she still had in her closed fist. The Marquesi crest. She walked over to one of the bookshelves, her fingers tracing the spines of the leather-bound volumes. She scanned the titles, her eyes searching for something, anything, that might resonate with the key, with the Marquesi family crest. Her eyes landed in a small section. Books about horses. She started to get every single book and open them one by one. She was in the 10th one when she found it. A small, rectangular hollow carved into the pages of the book. It was the perfect size for the key. Livia's heart skipped a beat. She carefully inserted the key into the hollow, her hands trembling slightly. She turned it gently. There was a click, a soft, satisfying sound that echoed in the silence. A section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a hidden passage. A secret room, concealed behind the facade of the library. A gasp escapes from Livia's lips. This was not real. She stepped into the passage, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had found something significant. But what awaited her in the darkness? The hidden door closed, leaving her in the darkness. This new discovery will make her question her own memories. Chapter 12. The Unraveling of Secrets. The darkness was absolute. Livia stood, frozen, her senses on high alert, straining to pierce the inky blackness. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust, and something metallic, almost coppery, that made her stomach churn. She reached out, her hand brushing against a cold, stone wall. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her feet moving slowly, cautiously across the uneven floor. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, her fingers clumsy with fear. She switched on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a small, confined space. It was a hidden room, barely large enough to turn around in, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone. The beam of her phone illuminated the room's contents, and Livia gasped. It was a scene of carnage, a tableau of violence frozen in time. Dried bloodstains marred the floor, dark and ominous against the stone. A heavy wooden chair lay overturned, its legs splintered. And on the wall, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were words. Words that made Livia's blood run cold. Traditor.
Morte ai Marchesi.
Traitor. Death to the Marqueses. Livia stared at the words, her mind reeling. This room, it was a torture chamber, a place of pain and death. A place where her father, or someone acting on his orders, had inflicted unspeakable cruelty. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a sickening realization of the darkness that lay at the heart of her family's legacy. The stories of honor and integrity, the carefully constructed facade of respectability, were all lies. Her father, the man she had idolized, was capable of monstrous acts. She stumbled backward, her back pressing against the cold stone wall. She had to get out of here, to escape the suffocating weight of this revelation. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight beam fell upon something else. Something that made her freeze, her heart pounding in her chest. In the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a tattered tapestry, was a small, wooden chest. It was old, its surface covered in intricate carvings, very similar to the little box she had. It was locked. Livia's mind raced.
The key.
The key she had found in the library. Could it possibly fit? She fumbled for the key, her hands trembling. She knelt before the chest, her flashlight illuminating the lock. She carefully inserted the key, her breath held captive in her throat. It fit. She turned the key, gently. There was a click, a soft, satisfying sound that echoed in the silence. The chest lid creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were documents. Old documents, tied together with faded ribbon. Livia carefully lifted them out, her hands shaking. She shone the flashlight on them, her eyes scanning the faded script. They were letters. Letters written in her mother's elegant handwriting. Letters addressed to Antonio Bellini. Livia's heart sank. The rumors. They were true. Her mother and Bellini had been lovers. A secret affair, hidden from her father's eyes. She began to read the letters, her eyes devouring the words. They were filled with passion, with longing, with a desperate love that had defied the boundaries of family and loyalty. Her mother had loved Bellini deeply, passionately. And he had loved her in return. The letters also spoke of fears. Fear of Alessandro. Fear of discovery. Fear for Livia's well-being, since she was a little girl. But there was something else. Something that made Livia's blood run cold. A mention of a secret, a conspiracy, a plan to overthrow her father. Livia stared at the words, her mind reeling. Her mother and Bellini, they had plotted against her father. They had been traitors, conspirators. And this room, this torture chamber, was it where her father had discovered their betrayal? Was it where he had exacted his revenge? Now she knows the rumors were true. Will it change anything? Chapter 13. Between Loyalty and Longing. The letter slipped from Livia's trembling fingers, scattering across the dusty floor of the hidden room. The truth, stark and brutal, lay exposed before her. Her mother, the woman she had revered, had been a traitor, a conspirator in a plot against her own husband. And Antonio Bellini, the man she had known as her father's trusted advisor, had been her mother's lover, her partner in betrayal. Livia felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Disbelief, anger, betrayal, and a strange, unsettling sense of understanding. Her mother's love for Bellini, so vividly expressed in the letters, was a force she couldn't deny. It was a love that had defied the constraints of her marriage, of her family's rigid code of honor. She picked up one of the letters, her fingers tracing the faded ink. Her mother's words, filled with passion and longing, spoke of a life she had yearned for, a life beyond the gilded cage of her marriage, a life with Bellini. Livia closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the image of her mother as a loving, devoted wife with the reality of her secret affair, of her betrayal. It was like trying to hold two opposing forces in her hands, the tension almost unbearable. She thought of Raphael, of his unwavering determination to reclaim his family's legacy, to avenge the wrongs that had been committed against them. She understood his anger, his thirst for justice. But now, she also understood the other side of the story, the hidden depths of love and betrayal that had fueled the conflict. She heard a sound, a faint noise from the library. She quickly switched off her phone's flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness. She held her breath, listening intently. Livia? It was Raphael's voice, filled with concern and a hint of relief. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Should she tell him what she had found? Should she reveal the truth about her mother, about Bellini? The consequences could be devastating. It could shatter the fragile truce they had established, reignite the flames of their family's feud. But she couldn't keep it to herself. She couldn't bear the weight of this secret alone. She needed his help, his guidance, his strength. Raphael, she called out, her voice trembling slightly. I'm in here. She heard his footsteps approaching, the sound of the hidden door opening. He appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the faint light of the library. He saw her, and a wave of relief washed over his face. Livia, he said, his voice soft. Are you all right? What happened? I heard a gunshot. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the darkness. Livia switched on her phone's flashlight, illuminating the scene. Raphael saw the bloodstains, the overturned chair, the words scrawled on the wall. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Livia took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. It's a torture chamber," she said, her voice shaking. "My father's." Raphael stared at her, his eyes filled with disbelief, then with a slow, dawning horror. He understood. He knew the implications of what she was saying. "And Bellini?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Livia held out the letters, her hands trembling. "He was my mother's lover," she said, her voice choked with emotion. They plotted against my father." Raphael took the letters, his fingers brushing against hers. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, anger, and something else. Something that looked almost like compassion. He held her gaze a few seconds, and then his eyes moved to read the letters. Livia watches in silence the turmoil that crosses Raphael's face.
What now?
What happens with the betrayal? Chapter 14. A storm of betrayal. Raphael read the letters, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief to a cold, controlled fury. The muscles in his jaw clenched, his eyes darkened with a dangerous intensity. Livia watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling empathy. She understood his anger, his sense of betrayal. He had been right all along. Her father had been a monster, a man who had built his empire on lies and violence. And her mother, the woman she had revered, had been complicit in his sins. He finished reading, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Livia, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. "This changes everything," he said, his voice low and strained. "Everything." Livia nodded, her own emotions a tangled mess of grief, anger, and a profound sense of loss. The world she had known, the carefully constructed narrative of her family's history, had crumbled before her eyes. "Bellini," Raphael said, his voice hardening. "He was behind the attack. He knew about the ledger about this room. He wanted to erase the evidence." Livia's mind raced. Bellini. He had been so close, so trusted. And yet, he had been harboring this secret, this hatred, for years. He had betrayed her father, betrayed her mother, betrayed her. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "We have to find him." Raphael nodded, his eyes gleaming with a fierce resolve. "He won't get away with this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I swear it." He turned to leave, but Livia stopped him, her hand on his arm. "Raphael," she said, her voice hesitant. "The gunshot, what happened?" Raphael hesitated, his gaze flickering away from hers. "It was Bellini," he said. "He tried to kill me, but I managed to disarm him." He paused, his voice softening slightly. He's alive, but he's injured. My men have him." Livia felt a wave of relief wash over her. Raphael was safe. That was all that mattered. But the relief was quickly followed by a surge of anger, of outrage. Bellini had tried to kill him. He had dared to attack the man she was beginning to care for, deeply. "I want to see him," she said, her voice firm. "I want to see Bellini." Raphael looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the determination in her gaze, the fire that had been ignited within her. He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. "But be careful, Livia. He's a dangerous man." He led her out of the hidden room, back into the library, back into the world of shadows and deceit. As they walked through the villa, Livia felt a storm brewing inside her, a tempest of conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. The betrayal of her mother, the violence of her father, the treachery of Bellini, it was all too much, too fast. When they got outside, the weather had changed. The wind howled around them, mirroring the storm that raged within Livia's heart and the storm that was about to break between the families. The storm is both literal and metaphorical. Chapter 15. The Shattered Reflection. The wind whipped Livia's hair around her face, stinging her eyes, mirroring the turmoil that churned within her. The sky had darkened, heavy with the threat of rain, a reflection of the storm that was about to break. They walked in silence, the only sound the howling wind and the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Raphael led her to a small, detached building at the edge of the villa's grounds, a place that had once been used as a staff quarters, but now served a more sinister purpose. It was a holding cell, a place where Raphael's men kept prisoners, those who had crossed him, those who threatened his empire. As they approached the building, Livia saw two of Raphael's men standing guard outside the door, their faces grim, their eyes watchful. They nodded respectfully to Raphael, then stepped aside, allowing him to unlock the heavy metal door. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale sweat and fear. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the room. In the center of the room, slumped in a chair, was Antonio Bellini. His face was bruised and swollen, his clothes torn and blood-stained. He looked up as they entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and something else. Something that looked almost like regret. Livia stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the man who had been her father's trusted advisor, her mother's lover, the architect of so much pain and betrayal. This was the man who had tried to kill Raphael. Bellini, Raphael said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. You have much to answer for. Bellini didn't reply. He simply stared at Livia, his eyes filled with a strange, unsettling intensity.
Why?
Livia asked, her voice trembling. Why did you do it? Bellini's lips curled into a bitter smile.
Why?
He repeated, his voice raspy. For love. For revenge. For what should have been mine. He looked at Livia, his gaze piercing. Your father, he said, his voice filled with venom. He stole everything from me. My life, my love, my legacy. My mother, Livia said, her voice barely a whisper. You loved her. Bellini nodded, slowly. I loved her more than life itself, he said, his voice choked with emotion. But your father, he kept her trapped. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. So you plotted against him, Livia said, her voice hardening. You betrayed him. He betrayed me first, Bellini retorted, his eyes flashing with anger. He stole my future, my happiness.
He deserved to die.
And the ledger? Raphael asked, his voice dangerously low. What did you hope to gain? Bellini's smile widened, a chilling, unsettling expression. The ledger, he said, was my insurance policy. My way to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The Marquesi Empire, it should have been mine. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. The depth of his hatred, his obsession, was terrifying. He was a man consumed by bitterness, by a thirst for revenge that had spanned decades. You were like a daughter to me, you know, he says to Livia, his eyes changing. I watched you grow. His voice breaks. His last confession makes Livia move away from him. Raphael stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife that was sheathed at his belt. You have caused enough pain, Bellini, he said, his voice cold and resolute. It ends here. Livia watched as she saw two sides of a coin, Raphael the cold, and Bellini the regretful. What now? What decision will be made? Chapter 16. Reclaiming the Ruins. Livia watched Raphael, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the cold fury in his eyes, the barely suppressed violence that simmered beneath his controlled exterior. He was ready to kill Bellini, to exact his revenge, to end the cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. But something stopped her. Something deep within her, a flicker of compassion, of understanding, made her reach out and touch Raphael's arm. No, she said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. It doesn't end here. Not like this. Raphael turned to her, his eyes questioning, his expression a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Livia, he said, his voice low and warning. He deserves to die. He betrayed your family. He tried to kill me, I know, Livia interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. But more death won't solve anything. It won't bring back my mother. It won't erase the past. It will only perpetuate the cycle of violence. She looked at Bellini, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and defeat. She saw not just a monster, but a broken man, a man consumed by his own demons, by a love that had turned toxic, by a thirst for revenge that had poisoned his soul. "Let him live," Livia said, her voice stronger now. "Let him face justice, yes, but not like this. Not in cold blood." Raphael stared at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. He searched her eyes, looking for any sign of weakness, of hesitation. But he found only determination, a newfound strength that had emerged from the ashes of her shattered past. He sighed, slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. The tension seemed to drain from his body, replaced by a weary resignation. "You are a better person than I am, Livia," he said, his voice soft. "You have a kindness, a compassion, that I lack." He turned to his men, who were watching the scene with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "Take him away," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Imprison him. He will face trial. He will answer for his crimes." The men nodded, their faces grim. They moved forward, roughly pulling Bellini to his feet. He didn't resist, his body limp, his spirit broken. As they led Bellini away, Livia felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had made a choice, a difficult choice, a choice that had defied the expectations of her family's legacy, of the brutal world she had been thrust into. Raphael turned to her, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. Admiration, respect, and something else. Something that looked almost like love. "You surprise me, Livia Marchesi," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You have a strength that I never anticipated." Livia met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a newfound confidence. "I'm not the girl I used to be, Raphael," she said, her voice firm. "I've seen too much, learned too much. I've changed." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. He held her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "We have much to do, Cara," he said. "The ledger, it holds the key to your father's empire. We need to unravel its secrets, to reclaim what is rightfully yours." Livia nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of trepidation and hope. She had a future now, a purpose. She was no longer a ghost, haunting the edges of her past. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman ready to reclaim her legacy, to build something new from the ruins of her shattered world. She was not alone anymore. With Bellini imprisoned, a new journey starts. Chapter 17. Blood Ties and Broken Bonds. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a deep dive into the labyrinthine world of Alessandro Marchesi's hidden empire. Livia and Raphael spent hours poring over the ledger, deciphering its cryptic entries, unraveling the complex web of his financial dealings, his secret alliances, his hidden assets. The ledger was a treasure trove of information, a map to a vast fortune that had been scattered across the globe, hidden in offshore accounts, shell corporations, and secret investments. It was also a testament to Alessandro's ruthlessness, his willingness to exploit, betray, and even murder to achieve his goals. Livia learned things about her father that she had never known, things that shattered the image she had held of him as a loving, protective parent. He had been a cold, calculating man, a master manipulator who had used everyone around him, including his own family, to further his ambitions. The revelations were painful, agonizing, but they were also liberating. Livia felt a sense of closure, a release from the burden of her idealized past. She could finally see her father for who he truly was, and in doing so, she could begin to forge her own path, to define her own identity, separate from his legacy of darkness. Raphael was by her side every step of the way, a constant source of support and guidance. He shared his knowledge of the underworld, his understanding of the complex dynamics of power and influence. He helped her navigate the treacherous waters of her father's empire, protecting her from those who would seek to exploit her, to steal what was rightfully hers. But their partnership was more than just a strategic alliance. It was a bond forged in shared trauma, in mutual respect, and in a growing, undeniable attraction. Livia found herself drawn to Raphael's strength, his intelligence, his unwavering determination. She saw beneath his cold exterior the vulnerability, the loneliness, the deep-seated pain that he had tried so hard to conceal. And he, in turn, saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering compassion. He admired her ability to forgive, to find empathy even for those who had wronged her, to choose mercy over vengeance. One evening, as they sat together in the library, poring over the ledger, Raphael looked at Livia, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. "You know," he said, his voice soft. "My father, he always warned me about the Marquesses. He said they were poison, that they would destroy everything they touched." Livia met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a sad understanding. "And your father, he was right, in a way," she said. "My father, he was a destructive force. He caused so much pain, so much suffering." Raphael nodded, slowly. "But you are different, Livia," he said. "You are not your father. You have a goodness, a light, that shines through the darkness." He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. He held her gaze, his eyes searching hers. I was wrong about you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I judged you by the sins of your family. I didn't see the woman you truly are." Livia felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of hope, of possibility. She had found something precious in the ruins of her past, something unexpected and beautiful. A connection with a man who had once been her enemy, a man who is now becoming something more. "We are more than our families, Raphael," she said, her voice filled with a newfound conviction. "We can choose our own paths. We can break the cycle of hatred and violence." That same night, they find out about a distant relative, someone that was never talked about, someone that might be a bigger threat than Bellini was. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. The discovery came late at night, buried deep within the ledger's cryptic entries. A name, a single, unfamiliar name, accompanied by a series of coded transactions and a cryptic reference to a family debt.
Elena Rossi.
Livia frowned, her mind struggling to place the name. It wasn't familiar. It didn't resonate with any of the figures she had known from her father's world. "Who is Elena Rossi?" she asked, turning to Raphael. Raphael's brow furrowed, his eyes scanning the ledger entry.
"I don't know," he said.
"It's not a name I recognize. But the amounts there significant. And the code, it suggests a connection to your father's inner circle." He continued to study the ledger, his fingers tracing the cryptic symbols. "There's a reference here to a family debt," he said. "Something unpaid. Something that goes back generations." Livia felt a chill run down her spine. A family debt? What did that mean? What kind of debt could be so significant, so enduring, that it would be recorded in her father's secret ledger? A debt that was still being paid by Alessandro. They spent the next few hours researching, digging through old family records, searching for any mention of Elena Rossi, of a family debt. The information was scarce, fragmented, but gradually, a picture began to emerge. Elena Rossi, it turned out, was a distant relative, a cousin of Livia's grandmother, a branch of the Marchesi family that had been disowned, banished, erased from the official family history. The reason for the disownment was shrouded in mystery, a secret that had been carefully guarded for generations. But the ledger entries suggested a connection, a financial link between Alessandro Marchesi and Elena Rossi. A series of payments, made regularly over decades, to a secret account in Switzerland. "It's like hush money," Raphael said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Your father was paying her off."
"But why?"
What did she know? What was the debt? Livia's mind raced. A disowned relative, a secret debt, a series of hush money payments, it all pointed to a hidden darkness, a secret that her father had desperately tried to bury. As they continued to investigate, they discovered something else. Something that made Livia's blood run cold. Elena Rossi was not just a distant relative. She was alive. And she was living in Italy, in a small, secluded village in the Tuscan countryside. "We need to find her," Livia said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. "We need to talk to her." Raphael nodded, his eyes gleaming with a fierce resolve. "She holds the key, Livia," he said. "The key to unlocking the past, to understanding the truth." That night, Livia couldn't sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, of fear anticipation, and a growing, undeniable sense of connection with Raphael. She had come to rely on him, to trust him, to see him not just as an ally, but as something more. She felt his absence in the big room. She got out of bed, and she went to his room, without thinking too much. She knocked, and entered when she heard his voice. He was on his bed, shirtless, reading some papers. He looked up, and for the first time, she allowed to feel what she had been repressing. He was beautiful in her eyes, and she knew that he felt the same. The unspoken feelings will surface between duty and desire. Chapter 19. Flames of Redemption. The air in Raphael's room was thick with unspoken tension, charged with the electricity of their shared gaze. Livia stood just inside the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest, her body acutely aware of his presence, of the bare skin of his chest, the sculpted muscles of his arms, the dark intensity of his eyes. He had been reading, papers scattered across the bed, but now he sat up, his gaze fixed on her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. "Livia," he said, his voice a low murmur, a question and a statement all in one. She couldn't speak, couldn't break the spell of his gaze. She simply stood there, her body trembling slightly, her mind a chaotic jumble of conflicting emotions. Desire, fear, longing, and a profound sense of inevitability. He slowly got out of bed. He was wearing only dark pants. He approached her. Not too close, but enough to make her feel his warmth. "What is it, Kara?" he asked, his voice softer now, a gentle caress that sent shivers down her spine. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, her eyes searching his. "Nothing's wrong," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I couldn't sleep." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited a fire within her. "Neither could I," he said, his voice husky, his eyes filled with a raw, undisguised desire. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the scent of his skin, a musky, intoxicating fragrance that made her senses swim. "Livia," he said again, his voice a ragged whisper. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. The longing, the desire, the undeniable attraction that had been simmering between them for weeks, for months, was finally boiling over, consuming them both. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. She responded, her own lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, a slow, sensual exploration that ignited a firestorm within her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his body molding against hers. She could feel the hard muscles of his chest, the rapid beat of his heart, a mirror of her own. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, her body trembling with a mixture of desire and fear. This was forbidden, dangerous, a betrayal of everything she had been taught, of the rigid code of honor that had governed her family for generations. But she didn't care. In this moment, nothing else mattered. Only him. Only this. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bed, his movements fluid and graceful. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. He followed her down, his body covering hers, a protective, possessive embrace. They surrendered in a long kiss. The night was filled with whispered words, with passionate embraces, with a love that had been born in the shadows, nurtured by shared trauma, and finally, gloriously, brought into the light. It was a love that defied the boundaries of family and loyalty, a love that transcended the darkness of their past, a love that offered a promise of redemption, of a future free from the shackles of hatred and violence. Livia gave herself to Raphael, completely, holding back nothing, all doubts gone. It was a merging of two souls, and a promise of a new life. Chapter 20. A dynasty forged anew. The dawn broke, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold, a gentle awakening after the passionate storm of the night. Livia lay nestled in Raphael's arms, her body warm and content, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace. She felt a connection with him that transcended the physical, a bond forged in shared trauma, in mutual respect, and in a love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. Raphael stirred beside her, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze soft and tender, a smile gracing his lips. "Buongiorno, cara," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. "Buongiorno," she replied, her own voice filled with a newfound warmth. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, lingering kiss that spoke of a shared intimacy, of a love that had deepened and solidified during the night. They lay in silence for a few moments, savoring the closeness, the quiet intimacy of the morning. But the realities of their world, the unfinished business that awaited them, soon intruded. "Elena Rossi," Livia said, her voice breaking the silence. "We need to find her." Raphael nodded, his expression turning serious.
"Yes," he said. "She holds the key. We need to understand the family debt."
They got out of bed, their movements slow and deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their relationship, of the bond that had been forged between them. They were no longer just allies, partners in a dangerous game. They were lovers, bound together by a shared passion, by a love that had defied the odds. They dressed quickly, their movements efficient and purposeful. They had a mission, a goal, and they were determined to achieve it, together. They got into the car. The journey to the village where Elena Rossi lived was long and winding, taking them through the rolling hills of the Tuscan countryside, a landscape of breathtaking beauty that belied the darkness that lay beneath the surface. As they approached the village, Livia felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She was about to confront a part of her family history that had been shrouded in secrecy, a secret that had the potential to shatter everything she thought she knew. They found Elena Rossi's house, a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was old, its walls weathered by time, its windows dark and secretive. It looked like a place that held secrets, a place where the past lingered, refusing to be forgotten. Raphael parked the car, and they got out, their movements cautious and deliberate. They approached the house, their senses on high alert. Raphael knocked on the door, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife that was concealed beneath his jacket. Livia stood beside him, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand instinctively reaching for his. He squeezed her hand, a silent reassurance, a gesture of solidarity. The door creaked open, revealing an old woman, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and fear. It was Elena Rossi.
"Signora Rossi?"
Raphael asked, his voice polite but firm.
"We need to talk to you."
"About the Marchesi family. About a family debt." The old woman's eyes widened, her expression shifting from suspicion to terror. She tried to close the door, but Raphael was too quick. He blocked the door with his foot, his gaze unwavering. "We know about the payments, Signora Rossi," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We know about the secret. It's time for the truth." The woman paled. "Alessandro is dead," she whispered. "The debt is gone." Raphael and Livia share a look. "The debt isn't gone, Signora, it has just changed hands." Raphael's words were cold. The confrontation with Elena and all the secrets. Epilogue. Elena Rossi's cottage was filled with the suffocating weight of unspoken truths, of a past that refused to stay buried. The old woman, her face etched with a lifetime of secrets and regrets, finally crumbled under the pressure of Raphael's unwavering gaze and Livia's quiet determination. She told them everything. The story she revealed was a tangled web of love, betrayal, and a blood feud that spanned generations. It began with Livia's great-grandfather, a ruthless and ambitious man who had built the Marchesi Empire on a foundation of violence and deceit. He had a brother, a younger brother, who was his polar opposite, gentle, artistic, and deeply in love with a woman named Isabella, a woman of common birth, a woman the great-grandfather deemed unworthy of the Marchesi name. The great-grandfather, in his ruthless ambition, had arranged a marriage for his brother, a union with a wealthy and powerful family that would solidify the Marchesi's position. But the brother, driven by his love for Isabella, had refused. He had eloped with her, defying his family, choosing love over duty. The great-grandfather, enraged by his brother's defiance, had retaliated with brutal force. He had disowned his brother, stripped him of his inheritance, and banished him from the family. But that wasn't enough. Consumed by a twisted sense of honor, he had hunted down the couple, and in a fit of rage, he had killed his own brother. Isabella, pregnant with his brother's child, had escaped, fleeing into hiding, vowing revenge. Elena Rossi was Isabella's granddaughter. The family debt was the price of silence, the hush money that Alessandro Marchesi had paid to keep Elena from revealing the truth, from exposing the dark secret at the heart of the Marchesi family history. Livia listened to the story, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, anger, and a profound sense of understanding. The cycle of violence, of betrayal, had spanned generations, casting a long shadow over her family's legacy. And the child? Livia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isabella's child, what happened to him? Elena Rossi looked at Livia, her eyes filled with a strange, unsettling intensity. He lived, she said. He was raised in secret, hidden from the Marchesi family. He grew up to be a powerful man. A man who never forgot his mother's vow of revenge. She paused, her gaze shifting to Raphael. His name was Eduardo Costa, Raphael's grandfather. The revelation hit Livia like a physical blow. Raphael and she, they were connected, not just by their present, but by their past, by a blood feud that had spanned generations. They were descendants of two brothers, locked in a cycle of violence and revenge. Raphael was pale. It was all a lie, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The rivalry, the hatred, it was all based on a lie.
Elena Rossi nodded, sadly.
Alessandro knew the truth, she said. He knew that the Costas were not his enemies, but his kin. But he perpetuated the lie, he fueled the hatred, to maintain his power, to control his empire. Livia looked at Raphael, her eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and a profound sense of sadness. But beneath the sadness, there was something else. Something stronger. A sense of hope. It doesn't have to be this way, she said, her voice firm. We can break the cycle. We can choose a different path. Raphael met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a newfound understanding. He saw the truth in her words, the possibility of redemption, of a future free from the shackles of the past. They decided to reveal the truth. They will unite both families. No more hate, no more deaths. The epilogue ends with Livia and Raphael, hand in hand, standing on the precipice of a new dawn, ready to forge a new dynasty, a dynasty built not on blood and violence, but on love and forgiveness. A dynasty that honored the past, but was not defined by it. A dynasty that would, finally, bring peace to the warring families, uniting them under a banner of shared heritage and a future filled with hope. They had a son and named him Alessandro, a way to remember and forgive. They rebuild what was lost, and they were not enemies anymore. They were family. The end.